Level 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, where you don't need years of university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects. We've created a list of helpful links on today's topic at our website, level989.com, and you can also find those links in the podcast playing app you're using right now.
This informal discussion shares our personal views. Don't rely on this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from a professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just an average Joe, and this gentleman here with me is anything but average. It's Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Hello, Brandon.
And good morning, Mike.
Our topic for today will be the origins of common medicines. Some of this stuff might be common knowledge, but a lot of it is also pretty surprising once you get into the details. I suppose we should start out with an important definition. What is a medicine? And don't go getting all technical on me and explaining that medicine is the science of healthcare. I'm talking about the drugs themselves. Also, are there differences between the Western and Eastern definitions of a medicine?
The word medicine is easier for me to define than you apparently expect it to be. Medicine, for the purposes of today's discussion, is simply a substance or preparation used in treating disease.
That was short and concise, and also straight out of Webster's dictionary. I checked.
Okay, you caught me. But I was just saving time so we could discuss a more interesting thought that your question brought up.
Ha! And what's that?
You said it yourself without prompting. Don't go explaining that medicine is the science of healthcare, you said. I'm talking about the drugs themselves. In the U.S., the term drug has become interchangeable with the word medicine.
I guess that's true. I have a problem with my health, go to the doctor, he gives me a pill, some sort of drug, right? To make me feel better. I take the prescribed drug to feel better. I take medicine to get better. I take it you don't agree with this practice.
It isn't that I disagree with using the words interchangeably. Webster's was kind enough to provide a definition for the word drug as well. A substance used as a medication or in the preparation of medication. And that's fine. It makes sense that drug and medicine have become synonymous with each other.
I'm not hearing the but. Does it have to do with the difference in how Eastern and Western practitioners define medicine?
I suppose it does, actually. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration plays a critical role in what is available to the public. In 1938, a set of laws were passed, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which gave the FDA their authority to oversee safety of food, drugs, and cosmetics. I know it sounds like a completely unrelated answer, but stick with me. The FDA has a set of definitions of their own, which is a bit more specific about what constitutes a drug. Part of that definition is that a drug is a substance other than a food intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Chinese medicine considers even basic foods as potential medicines. But by definition, the FDA dismisses foods as not being drugs. So, just to make sure I've been clear, can you explain why I'd be concerned about saying medicine and drugs are the same thing?
I think I might be able to do that. The FDA says foods aren't considered drugs. Complementary practitioners like yourself look at foods as potentially medicinal. If I accept that medicine means drug, then according to the FDA definitions, food would not be a medicine.
Exactly. It may seem needlessly semantic, but it's really important. From my point of view, what you eat on a daily basis is just as useful as a medicine, a substance for treating disease, as the pharmaceutical or herbal drugs a person might take or be prescribed.
I once read somewhere, many years ago now, that even water could be considered a medicine. Is there any technical truth to that, or is it just some silly saying that got stuck in my head?
I would argue on several levels that even something as simple as water can be a medicine. At the risk of repeating myself, here's the definition of medicine we want to remember for today's podcast. Any substance or preparation used in treating a disease. To a patient who's been outside for several hours in the hot Florida sun and begins to experience headache, increased thirst, possibly some dizziness, a glass or two of fresh water could be just the medicine they need.
One thing that was pretty clear to me from childhood was that most medicines do not directly make you better or cure your illness. Most medicines just take the edge off your symptoms while the body is working to heal itself. I assume there are technical terms for the stuff that eases symptoms versus the stuff that takes an active role in improving your condition. Can you explain these for us?
That question touches on so many fundamental philosophical questions regarding the practice of medicine. I'm not really sure where I would start to make a useful discussion. I think I'll have to cop out a little bit. Long story short, there isn't an official term for medicines that specifically improve someone's condition. For our purposes, let's use the words curative medicine, but that's a loaded term all by itself. Medicine that focuses on symptoms alone may be best called symptomatic medicine. If forced to give a personal opinion, I would go as far as to say that every medicine, curative or symptomatic, ultimately relies on the body's own mechanisms for actual improvement.
Now we come to a question we've touched on in a few previous episodes, and it needs mentioning again in this context. For many, if not most drugs, science still cannot completely explain how drugs produce the results they do, or forecast exactly how an individual will react when taking a new drug. How is this possible? We have electron microscopes that can directly image an atom. We've sequenced the human genome. How can we not know how a drug works, or the differences between how the same pill might affect me compared to affecting you?
The somewhat snarky but absolutely honest answer is that the human body is incredibly complex.
That's fair, but I think we could all benefit from a little bit more detail. Like I said, modern science has a ton of new tools at their disposal. At the very least, I would expect that things would be getting less complicated.
Unfortunately, the human body is so complex that even with all the advancements in modern science, we've only begun to scratch the surface. I've mentioned this before, but it seems worthwhile to bring the topic back up in this context. Modern medicine is centered around a reductionist mindset, focusing on smaller and smaller increments in an attempt to find a single linchpin for every health problem. For example, your average MD, when presented with a patient with a sore throat, will run tests to determine what bacteria or virus is causing the illness. Knowing exactly what organism is present allows them to select the appropriate medicine to remove that single, specific causal factor. The idea is that eventually it'll be possible to reduce any problem in the human body to its very base elements.
I do remember you going over this in a few of our other episodes. You're about to use the word holistic, aren't you?
Well done. Complementary medicine practitioners often adopt a holistic mindset, which states that it is the interaction of many different factors that lead to or create an accurate picture of any illness. The problem, or in my opinion, the wonderful conundrum of the human body, is that you really need to embrace both systems of thought to get an accurate diagnosis and treatment. The reductionist view makes treatment of foreign pathogens straightforward. Kill the pathogen, and as long as the body is working correctly, the patient will get better. But solving more complex illnesses can be made infinitely more difficult.
All right, I think I'm getting it, but do you have an example for us?
Sure thing. Mental health has become an incredibly important topic in the U.S. At this point, almost 20% of the population suffer from some form of mental illness. Emotional responses, as understood by modern science, are created by a small number of neurotransmitters in the brain. Of the 30 to 100 different molecule types discovered to date, it is said that 10 of those do 99% of the regulatory work in your body. Theoretically, then, it should be easy to determine what chemical needs to increase, which needs to decrease, to evoke the emotional responses the patient needs to improve their mental state. We know, however, that this isn't the case. Any guess why?
Well, maybe science just hasn't determined the real action of those other 90 molecule types. Or maybe there's some sort of interaction going on that requires a different balance or combination of neurotransmitters. Maybe the drugs used don't activate some other part of your brain that controls a certain emotional state. There's just too many possibilities.
And that's exactly why the mechanisms of many drugs and medicines, be they food level, herbal, or pharmaceutical, are still unexplained. With so many possibilities, it's no surprise that there's not yet a complete model constructed that explains every interaction. Even something as seemingly simple as testing a single drug's effect on the body becomes almost infinitely complex through this reductionist process. Any and every chemical and biological change that occurs after taking a medicine could be critical to resolving a health condition.
Talking about the origins of common drugs is actually a bit tricky. While, sure, some scientist in 1914 is credited with synthesizing and quantifying the chemistry of a now popular drug, turns out that drug was first used by Neanderthals 50,000 years ago as part of an herbal tea, and it has been used by humans ever since. So the story of any and all of these drugs is often a long strand that stretches far back into the past, woven into the complex tapestry of history. I mean, heck, I could make a strong case for a goat named Jeff discovering caffeine in 422 BC. What does your science say about that, mister?
Well, my science, or at least the medicine I've been trained to use, would be more than happy to accept that story without hesitation. Except maybe that the goat's name was Jeff. Something more Roman would be much more likely during that time period. How would you feel about Marcus the goat? In all seriousness, some herbal medicines are believed to have been discovered through the observation of animal behavior. By observing what plants an animal eats, especially when it's showing signs of illness, it is possible to find treatments for all kinds of conditions. There's even a Western term to describe the science of animal self-medication, zoopharmacognosy.
When I took a look at the list of the most common drugs online, the first few pages of search results were all tirades about illegal drugs. After that, I came across the most common prescriptions, a ton of erectile dysfunction meds. But none of that covered the logical next step for us, all the over-the-counter stuff that so many of us take every day. So let's start out with a nice slow pitch right across home plate. What can you tell us about the origins of one of the planet's most common drugs, aspirin?
It's great that you decided to start with this particular drug. Whenever someone starts a conversation about how herbal medicines are the root of modern pharmaceuticals, you'll hear the word aspirin, and for a good reason. Aspirin, also known as acetylsalicylic acid, is synthesized from an active ingredient found in the bark of many varieties of willow tree. But even without modern chemistry, cultures have been using the precursor to aspirin for, quite literally, thousands of years. One of the earliest historical references to the use of willow bark is found on an ancient Egyptian papyrus, which mentions its use when brewed in a tea as an anti-inflammatory or a pain reliever for generic and non-specific aches. Willow bark also appears in a number of ancient Chinese medical texts, appearing as Liu Shu Pi. It's again listed in large part to reduce fever and relieve pain.
We won't have time to do a deep dive on every drug we discussed today, but it looks like there's some dangers, or at least some concerns, when it comes to taking aspirin, especially for kids. What's that about?
There are always risks whenever taking any medication, even something that's been around as long and researched as much as aspirin. For adults, and especially for seniors over the age of 75, the primary risk involves the possibility of increased bleeding. For adults, and especially for seniors over the age of 75, the primary risk involves the possibility of increased bleeding. As you likely already know, aspirin also works as a blood thinner. For many years, doctors suggested taking an aspirin a day to help prevent clot-related strokes. Unfortunately, blood-thinning effects of aspirin also increase the likelihood of gastrointestinal bleeding, as well as the risk of experiencing a bleeding or hemorrhagic stroke.
And what about the risk to children? Is that related to blood thinning too?
Actually, there seems to be an even more worrisome risk to children that take aspirin. Reye's syndrome is a rare disorder which causes swelling of the liver and the brain, which has been associated with the use of aspirin in children, especially when recovering from flu or chickenpox. The same risk applies for certain other medications, including Pepto-Bismol and products that contain oil of wintergreen.
Yikes, minty fresh and deadly. One thing that people, Americans especially, need to remember that most of the world is industrialized and modern at this point. They have skyscrapers, subways, corner drugstores, and all the same, and often more, options for drugs as we do. Someone in any other modern nation might be just as likely to pop an Advil as you are, but they might also have different local options. So something like aspirin, or more likely Tylenol or ibuprofen, is probably the go-to for most folks in the US, but I'm sure that things are different around the world. What would be my go-to time-tested local remedy for headache in Germany, South Africa, China?
Truth be told, I'm not familiar with all the over-the-counter remedies available across the globe. There are herbal medicines and folk remedies, a couple of which you were kind enough to link to in today's episode notes, but I can't say if they're used instead of more common modern Western drugs, or if they've become more obscure as chemistry has developed newer, cheaper replacements. I am, of course, a little more familiar with the state of affairs in China. Herbal remedies remain an important part of daily life. Ibuprofen is used, especially for headaches, but there are numerous other medicines available for pain relief, including Tongjiang Ling, a patch used to treat muscular pain, and red flower oil, which is a topical spread on the skin.
We could spend a lot of time discussing specific medications. There are literally thousands of them. But perhaps it would be better to start by looking at the types of drugs that people commonly take. Say pain relievers, allergy pills, gastrointestinal products, and antibiotics. Let's explore an example from each category. We've already discussed aspirin a bit, so that can count as our entry for pain relief. Let's look into allergy aids. But we wouldn't be us if we didn't do this the hard way. Brandon, can you give us a breakdown of allergies and what's happening in the body during an allergic reaction? We're sure to have a full episode on allergies eventually, but just for now, maybe just a quick intro.
Keep it simple. Keep it simple. In order to keep it short, let's describe allergies from the Western medical perspective. In essence, an allergic reaction is the body's immune system overreacting to a potential invader. The same processes that protect against viruses and bacteria will occasionally, for reasons which still remain unknown, respond to substances that would usually be harmless to the human body.
And how does an antihistamine like pseudoephedrine, as was in over-the-counter Sudafed back in the good old days, help with an allergic reaction?
Actually, pseudoephedrine is a decongestant, not an antihistamine. And now I get to explain the differences between those two. Thanks, Mike.
No, I take it back.
Too late. Apparently, this is a common confusion for allergy sufferers. A decongestant works primarily by causing the blood vessels in the nasal membranes to narrow. That reduces inflammation, swelling, and mucus production. Antihistamines, on the other hand, act on the histamine receptors in the body, blocking histamine binding and reducing the reactions they cause. Antihistamines can reduce nasal congestion and sneezing, but also act on skin reactions like hives, reduce gastric acid conditions, and can be used to treat vertigo or motion sickness.
Before we forget, this is supposed to be about the origins of the drugs, not their mechanism of action. So, who invented antihistamines?
Well, if you're talking about the pharmaceutical development of antihistamines, the first significant breakthrough came from a Swiss scientist in 1937. If we're talking about natural products which have been used for their antihistamine properties, I couldn't tell you when or who was responsible for their initial discovery. Chinese medicine has many different herbal remedies for treating allergies, including lingzhi, a variety of mushroom found to act as a natural antihistamine. The list of natural antihistamines is a fairly long one. Stinging nettle, papaya, even basil has been used for their abilities to reduce allergic reactions.
All right, next up, or next down maybe, gastrointestinal products. There are a lot of them, and we could spend a whole episode just covering these drugs, and it would need to be a long episode. Let's start out with the top part of the digestive tract. How about a quick explanation of heartburn?
Heartburn, acid reflux, gastroesophageal reflux disease, they all amount to more or less the same thing. There's a small ring of muscle around the bottom of the esophagus. That's the tube that connects your throat with your stomach. And that muscle relaxes to allow food and liquid into your stomach. If this muscle weakens or relaxes abnormally, stomach acid can flow upward, causing damage to the esophagus, which most often manifests as a burning pain in the chest or throat, occurring especially after eating or in the evening, and may worsen when lying down or bending over.
The treatment for heartburn are primarily antacids, right? Seems like antihistamines are more about plugging into and blocking the receptors that histamine would plug into, interfering with the body's natural response, while antacids are more the result of a direct chemical reaction that cancels out the acid. Do I have that right?
I'm impressed. You must have been paying attention earlier when I said that antihistamines can be used to help reduce symptoms of gastric acid conditions. Very few people I've spoken to realize that antihistamines were, and are, still used to treat heartburn. You've got the basics down pat. Antacids are made from a basic substance, basic in the sense of acids and bases, not simple substances. But when an acid meets a base, they neutralize each other, which in the case of acid reflux will stop the acid present in the esophagus from continuing to damage tissue. The effects are fast-acting but short-lived, and if the problem happens with any frequency, it won't provide time for the damage in the esophagus to heal, which can lead to worse problems over time.
Okay, so what about antihistamines?
Antihistamines, things like Pepsid AC and Zantac, work by temporarily reducing the production of stomach acid. The end result is the same as if you were to take an antacid, but the effects can last longer than an antacid. The most significant downside is that they take much longer to take effect, so you'd usually need to take a pill about 30 minutes before eating for the drug to be effective.
There seem to be new types of heartburn medications all the time, and a lot of the new ones are prescriptions. How are these new treatments any different?
Both the drugs we've mentioned so far only relieve the symptoms of heartburn for a short period of time. Once the acid levels in the stomach return to normal, the symptoms will return. The newest type of drug treatment for long-term sufferers of acid reflux, or those who experience it frequently, are proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs for short. Taken regularly, this type of drug also interrupts the production of stomach acid, albeit through a different mechanism than the antihistamines use. The end result of PPI use is a long-term reduction in stomach acid, along with effects that are believed to assist in the repair of the damaged esophageal tissue.
I read several articles that mentioned potential risks taking PPIs. What can you tell me about that?
Well, evidence is still being collected, but recent studies are showing a series of pretty significant potential concerns. While PPIs are designed and intended to affect only the tissue lining of the stomach, it is possible that the chemical structure of these drugs may be interacting with other proton pump mechanisms elsewhere in the body. Links are beginning to be found that indicate a possible link between long-term use of PPIs and cardiovascular problems, kidney disease, even dementia. PPIs were initially used for short periods of time, no more than 2 weeks at once. Now, because they are so effective at reducing stomach acid, patients are being put on these drugs for years at a time, and the long-term side effects are just beginning to become apparent.
I've been thinking about your explanation of what heartburn really is, and I'm curious. From what you told us, the real problem isn't that the stomach is producing too much acid, it's that the muscle intended to keep the acid in the stomach isn't working well. So would you classify these heartburn medications as symptomatic medicine? I mean, reducing the acid levels isn't really fixing the problem.
That's a great observation, and one I would have pointed out myself if you hadn't been so kind as to bring it up. The damage stomach acid does, especially over a long period of time, can lead to a host of severe complications, including increased risk of esophageal cancer. Modern heartburn drugs are introduced as a way to reduce the damage stomach acid may do, but the root problem doesn't disappear when stomach acid is reduced, and other problems can arise from an insufficient amount of stomach acid. There is some evidence that even suggests many cases of heartburn arise initially from too little stomach acid, and a well-known concern with taking proton pump inhibitors is an effect called rebound hypersecretion, which means the body begins secreting more stomach acid as it attempts to return itself to normal acid production, which is a pretty significant problem, especially if the patient is trying to go off of PPIs for any reason. There are patients for whom the risks of drug-mediated stomach acid regulation are outweighed by the benefits, but it's distinctly possible that pharmaceutical methods aren't ideal for numerous patients.
So who invented the first heartburn remedy? Was it the Neanderthals shortly after they invented pizza? This one seems harder to pin down than the others have been.
For this one, I'll fall back again on my experience with Chinese medicine. Shengjiang, known to most of our listeners as fresh ginger, is noted with having several properties good for treating things like acid reflux. It has a property described as descending, and since heartburn is stomach acid going, essentially, up, descending would be a good thing, right? Ginger was called the sacred drug for vomiting, and vomiting is considered in Chinese medicine as a reversal of the normal flow of the body, the ascension of foods and liquids that ordinarily go down the digestive system, not up. Ginger is still a commonly used remedy for nausea and can potentially increase stomach acid. When used to treat the appropriate Chinese etiologies of heartburn, I have even seen it effectively reduce reported heartburn in my own clinical practice.
Moving farther down the digestive tract, let's take a look at what could politely be called tummy troubles, or less politely, the poops, the squirts, Montezuma's revenge, or hey, let's get technical, why not, and call it diarrhea. For most of us, diarrhea is just a pain in the backside for a day or two, but I came across a scary number. Over 1 million people died of diarrhea in 2013. That's serious stuff. Brandon, before we talk about treatment, can you explain the quick and dirty of diarrhea for us? What's actually happening in the body?
Most importantly, I want to make sure to mention, diarrhea isn't a disease by itself. It's possibly best to think of diarrhea as a sign, a symptom, a warning from your body that something isn't quite right. Diarrhea is an increase in the frequency and looseness or wateriness of bowel movements. It can be caused by increased secretion of fluid into the intestine, reduced absorption of fluid from the intestine, or rapid passage of stool through the intestine.
A good portion of the treatments for diarrhea seem to fall under the management category, as in dealing with the impacts on your body by taking in fluids, water, broth, tea, and electrolytes like salt. Maybe eat a banana to help replace lost potassium, maybe some spinach for the zinc. All of this just to replace what you've lost and help speed your recovery. But there's also the root cause to consider. How do we treat the little critters in our intestines that are causing the problem?
That completely depends on what critter, if it even is a critter, is causing the diarrhea. Frankly, and excuse the rant, this is one symptom that I don't really want to generalize, simply because the severity of the causal factor ranges so significantly. I think it's important that patients see their doctors about this issue. Mild diarrhea can be from something relatively harmless, like eating too much greasy food at once. Food poisoning can range from relatively harmless to fairly severe. Bacterial infection, viral infection, parasites, even malabsorption of foods from something like Crohn's disease. Treatment of the root cause of diarrhea can mean the difference between actually improving your health and just covering the symptoms of something much more dangerous. Short bouts of diarrhea can often be weathered without medical intervention, but be sure to contact your physician in cases where a fever is present and blood or mucus accompanies the diarrhea, the problem continues with fair amount of severity for more than 48 hours, or when you know you have a previous condition which may be exacerbated by loss of fluids, like a heart condition or diabetes, AIDS, or even pregnancy.
All right, let's move on to antibiotics. You can tell right off, just from the name, that this is a tricky one. We know about bacteria and viruses and parasites, but what's a biotic, and why are we so anti them? Sounds like some kind of old catch-all phrase.
And indeed it is. The term antibiotic comes from two ancient Greek words, anti, meaning opposing, and bios, meaning life. So antibiotics are literally drugs that oppose life. In truth, however, antibiotics don't oppose all life. They either kill or impede the life cycle of bacteria. Antibiotics are a type of antimicrobial, and antimicrobials, before you ask, are any substance of natural, semi-synthetic, or synthetic origin that kills or inhibits the growth of microorganisms but causes little or no damage to the host.
Now, we humans are just complex multicellular organisms with millions of tiny cells made up of even tinier organelles and other elements. How do we find a drug that kills E. coli but doesn't kill my own cells? A common science myth for years now has been that there are 10 times more microorganisms in our bodies than there are human cells. The actual number is apparently a lot lower than that, but it's all still under debate. The important question is, how can we really know what impact an antibiotic will have on all of that? I mean, I don't really know what kind of answer you could possibly have for that, but I'm curious.
Long story short, we can't know for sure. Each time a new antibiotic is created, heck, any drug is created, it's only through testing, animal studies, human trials, long-term use, you name it, that it becomes possible to find out exactly how it will affect the complex ecology that is the human body. Antibiotics don't just affect the pathogens, the foreign bacteria. Even the bacteria that make up your gut flora are affected every time you take even the lightest course of antibiotics.
So, the origin of antibiotics. When you consider that the first microscopes were invented about 400 years ago, and the first microbe was not discovered until the mid-1600s, I'm guessing the first antibiotics must date after that. Pretty clever, huh? See, I'm thinking, I'm paying attention. So, when were antibiotics first used? Say, 1700?
Now you're just being silly. Once again, some of the earliest use of antimicrobials are documented in Chinese medicine. There are a whole host of herbs which traditional Chinese medicine have been utilizing since 3000 BCE, which are being found to possess antimicrobial properties. One of the best known, Qing Hao, was used in treatment of many diseases and is today the root of a potent anti-malarial drug. You are correct, though. Before the invention of microscopes, or the discovery of microorganisms, the terminology was different. Chinese medicine doesn't describe these herbs in terms of their ability to kill microscopic creatures. Nevertheless, modern scientists have found traces of tetracycline, a well-known modern antibiotic, in Sudanese remains from 500 BCE.
Okay, fine. So I was off by several thousand years. It won't be the last time, I'm sure. Just don't let me pilot the time machine. Okay, so the first antibiotics were used forever ago, even if at the time we didn't know or understand exactly what we were fighting or how or why the treatment worked. Hey, that's not much different from today, is it? But what about the more modern, sciencey versions of antibiotics? Where did they get their start?
That kind of depends on how in-depth you want the discussion to be. The modern age of antibiotics can be traced as far back as 1899, but the event that most people have become familiar with is the discovery of the antibacterial properties of penicillin, a common mold, by Alexander Fleming. It was actually an accident. In 1928, Fleming found his petri dishes of Staphylococcus aureus, a bacteria which 30% of people carry in their noses, had been contaminated by mold. He was quite surprised to find, when he observed the dishes under his microscope, that the mold prevented the growth of the bacteria. 14 years later, the first patient was successfully treated with penicillin.
That was such a cool era when you could just be a dude with some petri dishes and, you take some careful notes over a period of years and you discover something.
I agree. I wish it was still possible.
A lot's been said in the past few years about the importance of the human microbiota, which are all these little critters that live in and on our bodies, helping to digest our food, protect our skin, our mouths, our lungs, and more. As a kid, I had pretty frequent ear infections, and so had many courses of antibiotics. I know there's still so much we don't know, but how are the antibiotics we're taking for things like ear infections impacting our whole system of critters, many of whom are there to help us?
Well, as I mentioned in a previous question, anytime a person takes an antibiotic, any and all bacteria in their system can, and often are, at risk. Western medicine is just beginning to understand the systemic importance of the bacterial flora found in the oral cavity and the digestive system. Links are being made between the delicate balance of bacteria in the gut and the function of many of the systems in the body, including brain function. Each time the decision is made to begin a course of antibiotics, the microbiota, the 1 trillion bacteria living in the gut, are at risk. While some of these changes are reversible, there are signs that some of these changes are completely irreversible. I don't want to put anyone off taking antibiotics. There are a wide variety of illnesses which are absolutely best treated with antibiotics, where, again, the benefits outweigh the risks. It's worth keeping in mind that making sure to take your antibiotics correctly, and take them only when necessary, may well protect you in ways modern science is still discovering. If you're interested in learning more about some of the modern research regarding antibiotics, I'm including some great links in the show notes.
So we've covered the major categories of common drugs, and this really could go on for hours. Everything from eye drops to mouthwash to lotion to sunscreen to antifungal foot powder. It all seems so basic and normal, but these are all carefully engineered medications that, yes, we can buy over the counter, but they're chemicals that impact and change how your body works. With any medication, it's important to read the labels, obey the instructions, and very importantly, remember that most medications should not be used in an ongoing manner every day for months. You shouldn't be popping Advil every few hours, every day, day after day. It seems like a basic drug, but too much of it will do bad things to your body over time. Brandon, do you have anything else before we wrap it up?
Initially, I envisioned this episode as more of a discussion of modern pharmaceuticals and those that found their roots in herbal tradition. As we worked through the questions and answers, I fear it may have become more of a comparison. Modern drugs and their herbal counterparts, a form of thinking I'd really like to discourage.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. That might just be the result of my work creating the initial structure of the episode, and that kind of sent you down a path you hadn't intended.
Not a problem. Modern pharmacology is an incredible tool. With it, there's the possibility of incredible healing. But, as you might have heard, with great power comes great responsibility. Modern drugs, because they're concentrated, new, and in many cases, if not most cases, still poorly understood, they come with risks. As a result, it is too often easy to fall into a black and white mindset. Instead of taking a risk with this drug, why not just choose to take a holistic herbal medicine instead? What I hope you take away from today's episode, rather than a sense that modern drug therapies are newer or better than their herbal antecedents, is an understanding that, in the end, any medicine, be it food, herbal, or pharmaceutical, is intended to do the most good and the least harm for the appropriate condition. And maybe, if I'm lucky, you'll also take away at least a little sense of wonder at the amazing things that can come from something as simple as a tree in your backyard.
Well said there, sir. Anybody who's interested in Mike and Brandon's Personal Health Goals Corner should stick around and listen after the music. That's all the time we have for today. These short episodes are a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware of changes you're planning to make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com, along with our contact information and the complete Don't Take Medical Advice from Podcasts disclaimer. Don't forget to take a moment to rate or review us in iTunes or give us a mention on social social media. We can't inform everyone if they don't know we exist. Thanks for listening, and now go health yourself. I don't really have a lot to report this time. Not much has changed. I'm still going to the gym, and in fact, you came along with me recently to my local gym. Officially, we were just hanging out, but were you observing me on the sly? Taking some medical-type notes?
Would I do that to you? I was just there to support you in your new exercise goals and enjoy working out with a friend. Although, I don't know that you managed to increase your heart rate enough to get an ideal cardiovascular workout.
Yes. The one thing I could improve is my intensity. I'm exercising, but I'm not really pushing myself by setting the machines to high resistance or high speed. I'm increasing my heart rate a bit, getting my blood moving. I'm definitely soaked with sweat by the end, but it's all cardio. How effective will the all-cardio approach be for my primary goal, weight loss?
You know, I've been trying to figure that out for some time now. You look at the advice of some physical trainers or health aficionados, and they'll say strength training is more likely to help you lose weight. Others will swear up and down that focusing on cardiovascular training will provide the best results for attaining weight loss. I've come to the conclusion that it really does depend on your body type, eating habits, personal preference. If you tend to eat a lot of carbs, longer cardiovascular workouts are a great way to use that type of fuel. At the same time, if you find running 10 miles a day boring, but love the feel after an intense weightlifting session, you're more likely to get results out of your weight training instead of cardiovascular. I guess my advice is, if you find cardio is what you enjoy, push yourself and see how it goes. Add in some resistance training, at least to get variety, but if you find yourself enjoying your treadmill or elliptical, you should definitely be able to keep your focus on cardio and still shed a few pounds.
Yep, that pretty much matches the results I've seen. I just have very little patience for the weight training equipment, be it a machine or free weights. I also need to take the step of adjusting my diet. Continuing to eat bad food will not lead me to where I want to go. How about you? I think you've been doing more outdoorsy workouts lately?
Outdoorsy? Well, yeah, I guess. And not running through the woods just yet. It's still way too hot for that. But my workouts at the stadium have been continuing well. A friend of mine in town, who's in better shape than I will probably ever be, has been kind enough to invite me to work out with him when he heads over there. He runs an 8-minute mile after we've completed our workout. That's 8 minutes after he's already worked his legs like crazy. I'm managing 9 on a good day, well rested. I generally feel like I'm holding him back, but he's very gracious about it. And after our workout sessions, I always feel like I've managed to push harder than when I'm by myself. I haven't been going to the gym as frequently as I probably should, but I am still seeing small gains in my weightlifting routine. My weight hasn't changed, still a few pounds heavier than when I started this latest push, but overall I think things are going pretty well.
Sounds great. Keep up the good work.
You do the same. And if any of our listeners are on their own fitness kick, whether just thinking about starting, or maybe you're buff as the Hulk and you have some tips to share, we'd really love to hear from you. Head on over to www.level989.com/contact and use the form to send us an email. We'd be thrilled to add a few of your stories to our Health Goals Corner.